Wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to No Food Live. I'm your host, Matthew Lang, joined by my co-host, Courtney Riggle. We're on opposite sides today. And we're here on our third episode of the No Food Live series. And we are getting a little bit better at this each time. This time, we're not so scripted. Having a little more fun as we get relaxed and into our roles here. So we're here to take a deep dive.
With the dad jokes.
Right, the dad jokes. Thank you, Rob, for that. We'll come back to that, maybe. We're going to take a deep dive right now into the world of food informatics and the Internet of Food.
Hi, everyone. Again, we're so pleased to have you join us for the third episode of No Food Live. It airs on the third Thursday of the month, so keep looking for us every month. And that's right, we've had 2 episodes now. Episode 1 was about the food ontology and the connections between molecular, or potential connections, because we still want to do this, between molecular components of food and those found in the world's largest knowledge graph about COVID-19. And episode 2 was looking at highlighting data across different food value chains and some of the different platforms that really collate that kind of data. And I particularly like the section on the food system dashboard at Johns Hopkins. And wasn't that cool, Matthew?
It was super cool. I can't wait to watch that emerge with a variety of data sets and tools. I think we're going to see a lot more of those kinds of things popping up. And as they pop up, hopefully, if you have a desire to be a guest on the show, well, get in touch with us. I guess this is also a great time to remind our audience that you can view the past episodes here on the YouTube channel. And if you subscribe, you'll never miss an episode.
But today, we welcome Valeria Pesce from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, Medha Devare from the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Rob Trice from Better Food Ventures and the Mixing Bowl. Our 3 esteemed guests, who you got to see in action already, will help us explore how elements of this emerging semantic web of food enable alignment and interoperability. I'll say that slower so you can hear me. Interoperability, say that fast 5 times, of food systems, ontologies, and data, and computation across larger sets of data to allow for some more robust and interesting analyses of food system aspects.
Right, so let's get started. First up, we've got Valeria Pesce. She is a data scientist in the statistics division at the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, also known as the FAO or FAO if you're in Europe. Valeria works on interoperability of statistical classifications and the harmonization of unconventional data sets. In recent years, she also worked on agricultural data policy issues, data infrastructure projects, collaborated with the Global Open Data for Ag and Nutrition Initiative, also known as GODAN, the Global Forum for Agricultural Research, also known as GFAR, and the World Bank, also known as the World Bank. So welcome, Valeria.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks. So I will go quickly because I know that you like the discussion time, and so these slides are only just a short introduction, and maybe will give us ideas for the discussion. I only have a few slides, basically around the issue of the lack of and usefulness of a map or a clear landscape of what exists already in the field of vocabularies for agriculture. And for food and agriculture, when I say vocabularies, I assume that we all more or less agree. I don't know if in the audience people work in this area, but we agree that vocabularies, when we speak of vocabularies, we mean semantic resources that help to represent knowledge in a structured and standardized way, let's say. So everything from thesauri to ontologies, classifications, taxonomies. The thing is, we've noticed over the past years with different exercises that we've done in different projects that nobody has the full picture of what is there. And yet this is an important thing, because why do you have vocabularies if then people don't use them? People have to know about vocabularies, what exists, and then use them as much as they can to speak about the same things. And we know that there is duplication, there is redundance, but without having a full picture of what is there, it's really difficult to harmonize and see where the redundancies are. So there have been some efforts in the last years to map this landscape of vocabularies. I will not go deeply into those because it would take too long, but there have been research and reports, like from the RDA, the Research Data Alliance Working Group Agri-Semantics. They've done a landscape exercise on that. The Go Done Action Project has done a number of reports on surveys of data standards in agriculture. And still in the Go Done Action context, we developed this map of data standards, and there is the AgroPortal initiative, and I will speak very briefly about these things in the next slides. Of course, you can do this exercise in several ways. You can build a map or a landscape of what is there by just studying and doing a study, some research. That, of course, is a once-off exercise. You have, of course, you can have a very coherent and balanced exposition and narrative of everything, but it's unstructured, it's not reusable, it becomes outdated very easily. You can build a catalog with metadata of all the existing vocabularies, and then have some searchable, some search engine, some machine readable metadata, some statistics, and that can be partial, of course, and unbalanced because it depends on who registers the data, how many you can really feature in one catalog, but it's still reusable. And it's the one other attempt that has been made, and we will shortly illustrate it later, is having a repository, which makes sense when you have, for instance, linked data vocabularies. They are machine readable. You can put them in a repository, and then you can everything is searchable, including the content. So this is a big drawing, a little complex. I will not go into the details of this because it will take hours, but it's part of the exercise that we did for a report, for some research. So it's completely based on what we know, on collaborations, partners, what we know that people are doing. There is no database that builds that. It's just from the knowledge that we have of the network. And as we know, it's a very complex network of vocabularies because food has to do with everything, with agricultural value chains, with everything that has to do with input resources and transport and nutrition, everything. So it's at the intersection of a lot of sectors. And this is just an attempt to represent what we have, the institutions that are working on vocabularies. And of course, you can also see in the report, the narrative outlines a number of commonalities between vocabularies and differences. You can very easily notice how, for instance, governments work on types of vocabularies that are classifications mostly, and thesauri, which makes sense because they have to set standards that are easy to apply, that just give the definitions and reference for the basic concepts, while research works a lot on ontologies. Because, of course, everything is about models. In research, you need complex models. And the private sector works on ontology as well, but also on these machine standards like Gateway develops or ISO develops. So slightly different contexts, but the landscape is very, very complex. This is the same thing, more or less, but more focused on the vocabularies rather than the institutions. And this is actually, I know that Rob wants to ask a question to all of us about how comes that we haven't solved the issue in all these years of having really standards and good vocabularies that everybody's using. And I think one of the reasons is this, the complexity of what we have, the legacy of what we have, and the fact that it's not necessarily redundancy or duplication. Some of these things are actually serve different purposes. So it's difficult really to harmonize. And also you can see below here the number of sectors and different streams of data that you have to harmonize, which is very, very, very difficult. Couple of very quick slides. I don't have much text, just graphs and pictures. This comes from research, okay? Narratives and reports. This is actually two resources that have been built to make these resources searchable and to help have a place where you can go and search and look for vocabularies that exist. So on the left, you have the map of agricultural data standards, which is a catalog of metadata, just metadata that you put about vocabularies. And on the right, you have a repository of actual content of vocabularies in linked data formats. You can build interesting stuff from here. You can have search engines. On the left, the graph that you see below is actually built only on the metadata. So it depends on the quality of what you actually collect and submit to the database. While on the right, this complex network is built on the actual content and metadata of the vocabularies as it comes from the machine readable descriptions of the vocabulary. So much more powerful. If you manage to have these maps, this sort of databases, you of course can build a lot of nice statistics and gain a lot of knowledge from the data that you have. You can build tables with, for instance, if you have metadata about the quality of these vocabularies, you can easily build matrices where you can see the quality, the availability, the level of availability, the level of usability, etc. Or you can have these charts by sector. On the right, you see what the agriculture can build based on the content of these ontologies. They can build nice graphs that give you an idea of the landscape. So hopefully one day, if you have everything machine readable and represented somewhere, as you see in the last graph here, the most active organizations, maybe one day you can have something like this, like generated by actual database. One last slide, as I said, I wanted to be very short, is about what we are doing in FAO and what Matthew mentioned. We're working on making statistical classifications interoperable and linked open data enabled. So it's I will not go deeply into this because I understand that maybe there will be an episode in the future that will feature this product. This is just to give you an idea that even in, it's in a very small sector like just statistical classifications, there is a lot, and a lot still has to be made interoperable. So even another reason, Rob, why we haven't solved the problem so far. So these were my short slides, and I hope, Matthew, I was short enough. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Valeria. That was a super helpful overview of what's going on. And there's clearly been a huge effort to both build the landscape and understand it. So let me ask you one quick question. Where do you think the most work remains to be done? Is it in kind of building and harmonizing more standards, or is it really in the adoption piece, getting people to use them?
I would say definitely into the adoption. Of course, there is a lot to do in harmonizing, mapping, because that also helps with the adoption, actually, because if people have to adopt a vocabulary and there is a number of vocabularies that look like duplicate or similar, you don't know what to choose. And when you choose, you know that it's not interoperable with the others. The adoption, of course, cannot be high. So they're linked. Of course, the more you can harmonize and make things interoperable, the more adoption you will have. But then there is a lot also to do for the adoption in terms of tools and making things easy. It's still not easy to make any kind of vocabulary interoperable. And for many people, this is something, many institutions, small institutions, and there are so many actors involved in the value chain that if it's not easy to use, and if it's not used in all the steps of the value chain, it's not of much help. So I think in terms of adoption is the most important thing, and tools and any kind of techniques that makes it easy will help. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Well, let's shift our focus to our next guest, Dr. Medha Devare. Medha is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI, and leads one of 3 modules on the CGIAR platform for big data in agriculture. And prior to this, she led the CGIAR Systems Open Data Open Access Initiative. So Medha, can you tell us about your current initiatives and the tools and methods that are being developed, and how they can help access the treasure trove of agricultural data within CGIAR?
Absolutely. So okay, so you should be able to see my screen now, and I need to turn it to presentation. Sorry. That's odd. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen. I'm going to be switching gears a little bit, sort of following right on to that last little bit that Valeria talked about, adoption and some of the enabling conditions. So I'm going to dive in and tell you about CGIAR's fairy tale, which hopefully doesn't end in the big bad ogre eating us all up. It hopefully ends happily. So the first thing that we did, apart from the Open Access and Open Data initiative that was started in about 2015, was when it really went operational, was the to have in place the platform for big data in agriculture. And as part of this, there were 3 modules, and one of the modules focused primarily on data and data management, particularly with the goal of enabling fair and open outcomes. So broadly speaking, the enabling conditions there we found to be the culture, which is absolutely critical and is probably one of the most difficult things in terms of getting towards interoperability. The findability, accessibility of FAIR tends to be easier. The interoperability tends to be much, much more difficult, and the reusability sort of depends on the other 3. So the focus on interoperability here, I think, is spot on. The other piece of this accompanying culture is capacity. You need to build the capacity, upskill your general stakeholders if you're going to be able to sustain, make things interoperable and sustain them. The technology piece is, of course, critical as well, but I think it takes it's easier anyway to manage than the culture, certainly. And then I like to put the so what of this. You've got all of these other 3 pieces. What does that mean for me as a researcher? And until you can show me what it means for me as a researcher, you're probably not going to be able to succeed. So there are different pieces of this. What have we sort of done? What has our path been in terms of the culture? Well, there have been various approaches to this. We've had an open access and data management policy in place across CGIAR that applies to all 15 of our centers since about the end of 2013. What we've done more recently is to have a sort of an assessment of data management maturity. So this is the Data Management Maturity Assessment, or DMMA, that was run by Accenture. And what it did was to look at what our data management practices were across the organization, across all of our centers, and sort of highlight what might be best practices and how we might get there. Sort of in around the same time, this is sort of a screenshot from an almost finalized digital strategy that we're developing for the entire organization, again, through the big data platform. And here, what we're trying to make people aware of is what are the trends in the sector in terms of digitally transforming agriculture. What do we need there? Interoperability, FAIR in general, plays a big role in this. And what capabilities, more importantly, what capabilities do we need to put in place over the next few years in a relatively short timeline to be able to successfully leverage those trends? And what role does CGIAR and other public sector organizations like ours, what roles do they have to play in this? The last thing is, of course, the policy. I'd mentioned that we had one that was called the Open Access and Data Management Policy. Very shortly, we should have, we hope, a policy that makes much more explicit FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and suggests things like, the need for key performance indicators that focus on open and fair assets and not just data, particularly, and not just on high impact factor publications, which has kind of been the go-to for most research focused organizations. Again, the KPIs go with, rewarding open and fair data assets, making it clear that projects need to be formulated hand in hand as far as possible with those that are responsible for stewarding data, and allocating budgets for open and fair, and then sort of putting in place accountability and ownership at a high level, having leadership say, yes, I own this, and we're going to make it happen. So this is sort of just a little snapshot of what we're trying to do to address the culture piece of it. There's much more, but those are the sort of the highlights. In terms of capacity, through the big data platform, the second module of the big data platform, which is called Convene, there have been a number of communities of practice set up, and these are primarily CGIAR, but not really. I mean, in some of them, 50% or more of the membership tends to be external to CGIAR. So there's a healthy amount of cross-pollination going on. So we're not all sitting there staring at our navels. I've outlined some of these for you there, and they tend to interact quite well with each other. They're not sort of, silos in their own sense. And there's a link there. So if this is shared with you, you'll be able to see, you'll be able to go in and actually join one of these or more if you're interested. The thing we're talking about today in terms of interoperability is primarily the focus of the ontologies community of practice and the information and data management community of practice. And again, there are some links here for you to go on. But the other thing that we do quite regularly, very, very frequently, in fact, throughout these COPs and in other ways as well, is to offer a lot of webinars. And you can see here, one of the ontologies community of practice webinar on the Agronomy Ontology and AgroFIMS, which allows you to collect agronomic data that's already born fair. Make it easy for researchers, and they might actually do it. And then there's another webinar that was offered recently on sort of, how does private sector fit into this, and are we talking about monetizing data, and how do we get there, and so on. There's a number of different webinars that you can also get to from this big data page that I've already provided links to. There are trainings as well that we offer. And then, of course, hand in hand with all of this is the technology. The technology, as I said, is important. What we've set up is something called Guardian, which is essentially a metadata harvester. So what we're doing is not pulling data from where it sits, but wherever the data sits in whatever repositories it sits in, we try to create a one-stop shop for this so that it becomes more and more go-to knowledge base in the agricultural domain. And right now we have almost 200,000 publications and almost 40,000 data sets that are coming from all of the CGIAR centers, all of their repositories, the publications and data repositories, which tend to be separate, as well as the World Bank, the USAID's Digital Data Library, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office of the UK, the Indian government's Open Data Portal, and many other sources of data. And a lot of this is mappable, visualizable, etc. What I want to point out, and of course, when you use this, what you'll do is just simply go in and type some keywords and get some search results segregated essentially by data sets or publications. There's also a data management toolkit. So that gets to the heart again of the culture and the capacity, trying to put in one place the resources that you can use to make your data more open and more fair. And I've included the URL if you want to have a look at that. So in terms of what things actually look like here, here's a data set that we're looking at. Typically, where possible, we try to offer the licensing terms in the form of a machine readable license. That's what we're encouraging across CGIAR, and a consistent look and feel. This is a data set, but you're seeing keywords there that come from ontologies, from AgriVoc, from a controlled vocabulary. You also see a fair a metric, a fair, how fair is this thing? And that's not to police anybody or do anything like that, but to try and help the researchers and the data stewards themselves get to fairer data assets, to more interoperable data assets, which is where typically the gaps tend to be. So the last thing I want to talk about is so what? And so what we've done through small grants and increasingly through people just finding what we've done useful is to show the value proposition behind having fairer data, behind having more findable data. In this case, this is a study that was done by researchers at two CGIAR centers as well as UC Davis. And what they did was to try and get at the broader question of what, is fertilizer use profitable across all of Africa? Where is it most profitable, and where might it, be less profitable? And so what they did was to dive into Guardian to find over 120 data sets that were not all interoperable. So they spent quite a bit of time with the cleaning and processing, but they were able to find the data, which is a huge move in the right direction. They were able to access the data, which is a huge move in the right direction. Thousands and thousands of data points. They were able to develop their machine learning model, and then ultimately adding price information, input and output information, actually get to get an answer to the question they wanted to answer, which is, what is the profitability of fertilizer use? Where might fertilizer use make more sense? Under what circumstances? That this is starting to get at the sort of the brass tacks here. So by showing the value of what the budgeting and the time it takes to make data more interoperable, I think we can get much further in combination with the capacity, culture, and the technology pieces. Thanks. That's what I wanted to say.
Well, that was awesome, Medha. Thank you so much. It sounds like I'm just going to sort of pick on your second to last slide there. You said some of that data was findable, it was accessible, but it wasn't necessarily interoperable, and that it took a lot of cleaning. So it sounds like we've got FA data. We're not quite fair, not necessarily quite interoperable or reusable yet. What's needed from your perspective? What's needed to get us to from FA to fair?
Yeah, I think it's some of the stuff that I kind of alluded to quickly, but a lot of it is getting the buy-in from researchers and getting the understanding that this doesn't come for free. It does have a cost, and so you need to budget for it. You need to budget for data management. That's as much a part of research as going out and collecting new data. So that's number one. Number two is making it easy for people to actually do this. So increasingly, our efforts are focusing on trying to enable born fair data. So for agronomy, which is my field, we have the thing called AgroFIMS, the Agronomy Field Information Management System, and we're working with the IIT, another one of our centers, to sort of converge on something they've got called Sandman, which are complementary. And so the idea is to try and enable data to be collected on farmers' fields that's already adhering to ontologies, and that allows you to then get fair data without having to do much extra effort, and have it aligned with a consistent metadata schema as well. So we've got a consistent metadata schema that's already being used across much of CGIAR. So I think we've come a long way. We've gone a long way towards it, but there are some key little pieces that are missing, and I think increasingly we're able to push the string a little bit more farther uphill as we move forward.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Sure.
I want to come back to some of that, but right now I want to turn to Rob, our next guest, Rob Trice. He's the founder of Better Food Ventures and the Mixing Bowl. Rob, can you tell us a little bit about your organizations and specifically, you've got a new initiative, IDEA, Interoperable Data for Enhancing Agriculture. What's this all about? Why do we need yet another program that's doing interoperability? Rob, I think you're muted, and sorry, I'm not sure what happened, but I think you need to start again.
I think so. I was muted. I apologize.
No problem. Can you back up and hit us again with all that?
You bet.
All right, cool. Thanks.
How's that? Good?
That's great. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, so as Matt, I apologize there. So I started Mixed Bowl and Better Food Ventures back in 2014 after spending about a dozen years or so in venture capital in the mobile internet telecom space. And the Mixing Bowl and Better Food Ventures is harnessing IT innovation for positive impact now. We do that through three things: thought and action leadership, advising, and then also tech funding through a vehicle called Better Food Ventures. I'll tell more about that. Yeah, I mentioned that I was in the mobile internet space, and part of what attracted me to food and agriculture or agri-food tech is that 5 to 10% of the world's economy is food and agriculture, yet it's the least digitized major sector of the economy, according to McKinsey. And yet we believe that if we can now apply digital technology, we can expand the value of food and ag markets, whether that is through decreasing food waste, maximizing profitability, sustainability, providing consumers with transparency, and so forth. We break this down into ag tech, food tech, and quote unquote messy middle of food, which is between the farm gate and retail. And there's a lot of opportunity, as I think we'll discuss. One of the things that is amazing to me stepping into this space is how nascent digital adoption still is. We call this the ag tech technology adoption curve. We fundamentally look at the fact that we have to crawl before we walk, before we run. And a lot of the super fancy technologies that have been developed are still a long way away from being adopted by farmers and ranchers because they're still back in this first step on the staircase, moving towards the second space. So if you look at each one of these different steps on the staircase about digitizing, measuring, managing, optimizing, and automate, there's a corresponding IT system. And the biggest barrier that we have to digitizing food and agriculture right now is the farmer's notebook, or the 3-ring binder that they have where they're keeping their valuable notes. We need to get them to use digital tools. And then hopefully those are interoperable tools where we can share that and aggregate that information. So as Matt mentioned, I've been frustrated. If I look back at the mobile internet space, we invested in a company in early 2000 called Mighty Phone that allowed you to sync information, calendar information, between your phone and your desktop PC, which seemed like a magical thing to be able to do. And I look at what we saw in terms of the mobile internet and how that developed. We had hundreds of venture-backed companies that were doing middleware, connecting your Motorola phone to your Nokia phone. And then what really was the game changer were a couple different standards and systems of systems that developed. One, HTML5, which made it easier to use the browser on almost any device. Two was the iOS platform, so that you could write once to almost any iPhone, and then you had a way to monetize. Prior to that, when I worked for Nokia's venture capital group, it cost about $75,000 to develop a mobile application for mobile handsets on the Symbian OS. I feel like we're sometimes in that same step where the pre-iOS stages in agriculture. It's at those back when you couldn't share a Word doc on a Mac computer. We have a friend in the Central Valley of California who has 42 different data dashboards because his weather station doesn't talk to his irrigation system, doesn't talk to his John Deere equipment. And so these are the fundamentals that we need to really start breaking down. And so all the startups that I see in this space have their own ontology. Whatever they're doing, they're all proprietary, and they all say that they have an API. But that API doesn't talk to anybody else's API. And that is the fundamental barrier that I see. And so given that frustration last year, I started a group called IDEA, Interoperable Data to Enhance Agriculture, where I got the people that are working on interoperable data to start interoperating with one another, because Ag Gateway wasn't talking to the Purdue Open Ag Technology Systems Center, wasn't talking to Open Team, or the newly established Linux Foundation, Open Ag, or now Ag Stack, didn't know about Open Team. And so we created this space for those people working on interoperable data to come together and talk about how we could work collaboratively to raise awareness of the need for interoperability and start learn by doing. And to that, what we did is we actually had the National Pork Board raise their hand and say, we'll be your guinea pig, pun intended. And so what we did back in November with the Purdue Open Ag Technology Systems Center, a partner called Centricity, and the Farm Foundation, is we basically did an event storming where we had pig farmers from Nebraska and Illinois sit down with technologists, and we mapped out virtually. Oh, we also, by the way, had Ag Gateway Europe involved because they had actually done a semantic mapping for a project called ePigs. And so we worked collaboratively. We mapped out the data and the decision points throughout the value chain. And from that, we identified some gaps. And now what we're going to do this year are a series of 3 hackathon type events to develop practical interoperable solutions to fill data gaps. And the first one is actually going to be next week in conjunction with the Purdue OatsCon 21. And so this is a little bit of a promotional flyer here. The Purdue OatsCon is next week. The hackathon will be happening in the background. And our objective is not of this hackathon is not beer and pizza and prize money. It's really basic. All we're trying to do is create an advanced ship notification so that a pig farmer can notify a processor that a trucker is coming to pick up those pigs and haul them to the processor, and they'll have an estimated time when the 100 pigs will show up on the dock of the processing station. And then we can get a return path to say, from the processor, we've received your 100 pigs. It's that simple, but that's the kind of work that we need. It's the basic blocking and tackling that I think we need to really move the ball forward in interoperable data. That's all I got.
Thanks, Rob. That's awesome. So, you know, sometimes when we build ontologies, we talk about sort of top down, which generally happens from a domain expert. I understand this field, I know all of the nuances, and I can build the classification systems. And this is often academic exercise. But we also have this sort of bottom-up exercise where we've got data, we're trying to classify it, then we build the abstract classes around that data. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me your approach is more this bottom-up, where you know, you said something to me the other day. You said I'm working on I'm not concerned about standards right now. I'm concerned about interoperability. And I was meaning to poke you with this before you just gave your talk just now. But after listening to you, I think I'm convinced that this is a bottom-up approach to actually making standards, because what you're talking about, the delivery of the pork could be cattle, it could be chickens, it could be a variety of things. Now, there may be some circumstances where, you know, pigs are different, but it seems to me that what you're building could at some point be abstracted into other livestock. Would you say that? Is that fair to say?
Interoperable and reusable. Yes, that's exactly
right.
Right. So I actually want to tell a very quick story. When I started working on IDEA, there was somebody in the academic in the ag ontology academic community that I reached out to, and they said, this problem has already been solved. We don't need IDEA. And we had about a 25-minute conversation until what I realized is this person was thinking that because there is an ontology that's been developed for rutabaga sitting on some academic shelf somewhere, that the problem has been solved. But that's not the fact. We need to make sure that ontology is in the hands of the rutabaga farmer, right? Once we've done that, then the problem is solved. But having it just develop, it's not going to do any good. And I think you're exactly right. And I just listened to the previous two speakers. We need the top down. We need the bottoms up. The thing is, though, I look at this and there are so many other standards that we can be leveraging. whether that is in agriculture and food, UPC codes, GS1. There are other standards that we've got, like ISO standards for machinery. All of these standards should be closing the gap, and we should be getting to the point where we should have the rutabaga farmers of the world unite to accept nothing less than interoperable solutions. If you were to go out and buy a dumb TV right now, would you buy a dumb TV that didn't connect to the internet and be able to display in a standardized format? No. You have expectations that that apps are going to work regardless, maybe not Clubhouse, but are going to work across device, right? So we have this expectation throughout the rest of our lives. So why do farmers and ranchers settle for proprietary solutions that are dumb, that don't talk to anything else? We need to push those solution providers to leverage those ontologies that exist and go make this market.
I agree. I'm gonna add the others in here, and I'm gonna open this up here. If we could all sort of take a look at this. Now, I think probably all of us have seen this before, and I think that there is a worry that the bottom-up approach will actually cause some issues. So maybe, I'm not going to point the finger at who wants to chime in about this. I'm going to let you guys try to talk over each other. But it seems to me that if you're saying, yeah, there's this academic thing, but we need to build our own, or why not reuse the academic thing? Why not find a way to tie, as an analogy, these 14 standards together and make them interoperable rather than having a hackathon to build yet another standard?
So I think you're exactly right. We don't need new standards. We need interoperability of the existing solutions. And then we can create a marketplace of standards. And you're going to see these platforms start to arise, right? So that then those people who are developing platforms or using platforms or buying platforms, those people we could create competition between those platforms based on the usability and the value that that's bringing to a farmer or a rancher or a trucker or a food company.
Yeah. Medha, do you have an opinion here?
Well, I think I agree that we've got too many standards for sure. And it would be nice for a researcher who doesn't, for us, the problem's a little bit different, right? We're talking about research data that needs to be annotated. And so even if you have a workflow that helps you annotate legacy data, say it's a high value legacy data set, you need to be able to annotate it easily. As a researcher, I may not know anything about what an ontology is or how it works, but I've been told to use it. So damn well make it easy for me to use then, first of all, the tool should be easy, which, we're working towards easier and easier tools to use for researchers. But then don't give me 10 different choices and ask me to figure out which one's the better one. That's where I think things get complicated. And I think that having multiple standards is a real issue. We had at one point, discussions around kind of mapping across similar ontologies, or trying to our own approach, for instance, has been with I can speak to the one that I'm most intimately involved in, which is the Agronomy Ontology. There, our approach has been to use terms and concepts where they exist in other ontologies, and try not to anyway build a new one on our own. Where it starts falling apart is when it takes time for the stewards of those other ontologies to respond. And we need to deliver soon. We need to deliver something quickly. How are we supposed to then approach that problem? I think this is where some of these issues arise with multiple standards. So it's a thorny problem. I'm not entirely sure of the answer, other than to say we absolutely have that problem and we need to get around it.
Valeria, what's your take?
I was thinking, of course, this we all know this cartoon, and we completely agree. The thing about having new standards, what Rob was saying at the beginning, the example of building a new ontology. Building a new ontology, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily mean building a new standard. An ontology is a view on things. If you build an ontology because you need a new way of viewing something, building new relationships because you need a new model, you may need a new model. It's not that you're building a new standard. The thing is, as Medha was saying, if you build a new model reusing what is already existing, and that's the difference that Rob was mentioning between being interoperable and having a standard. It's not necessarily the same thing. You can have a new ontology that is completely interoperable with an existing standard, and then that, in my opinion, is not redundancy. So it's not really necessarily if you build a new ontology, you are multiplying the standards. I think there's a difference between building new models and reusing the standards that exist, and you can still do that. I mean, it's not necessarily a different thing.
Okay, great. So Hande has a question, and I'm putting. Good to see you, Hande. I'm putting her question up on the screen here. How about data quality? We've got findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but how do we know if the data is any good?
Can I take a stab at that?
Well, please do.
It's this is something we've been struggling with for some time. The quality assessment. I mean, typically the data sets that we are encountering in the world we live in, which is, agricultural research for development, are typically data sets that underlie publications. So there's already been publications around this, and you would think that in order to publish, you would have to have data that you can, rely on. Now, maybe once you start leveraging the data for some other, you start turning it around, you start looking at it from another angle, you start finding issues with the data. But the only way that you can actually assess quality is by reusing data. So it's kind of a circular, argument, I think. I mean, the whole point of making data open and fair is to validate much more the data that's out there. And at a future point, it would be great if somehow we were able to sort of showcase, the more popular data sets in a particular, or those were the ones those would be the ones presumably that floated to the top when you were doing searches in any kind of knowledge base. So I think the two do go hand in hand, but I think the quality assessment to some extent comes from the re-examination of the data and the reproducibility that of the work that underlies that data once you start looking into it.
Great. And what do you think, Rob? How do you plan to talk about quality with your pork initiative?
Well, I think it's interesting. Actually, I want to say one thing just about IDEA and what we're doing, right? Which is I just want to use the digital superhighway analogy. I want to just create the highway. I want to connect the towns. There, in Medha, you talked about the need for fair use. Those things I totally, and privacy, those things are incredibly important. I looked at those as the on-ramps and the off-ramps for that highway. All I want to do right now is just build the roads. If we create that interconnectivity, then there are tools out there to help us manage the use and the privacy, particularly of farmers' data. To the question of quality, and again, I want to be cognizant that Medha specifically is looking at research data. If I look at it from a farm perspective, a farmer's data, and looking at that, one of the benefits is as we accumulate more data, we can more readily identify outliers to data. Oh, you increased your soil organic carbon 9% in 1 year. That is an unbelievable statistic. And thus we're going to throw that out because that's a deviation. So the more that we can gather that data and understand what are normalized data practices, we can identify what is bad quality data and try to avoid that garbage in, garbage out. One of the other questions that I've got is a lot about calibration, particularly of sensors. I'm spending a lot of time right now looking at soil, for instance. we don't have much information looking at soil measurement, as it's soil organic matter, soil carbon, and so forth, and the variability in different sensors in the field. And so we need that harmonization so that we can avoid that garbage in problem.
Great. How about you, Valeria? Do you have an opinion here? How does the FAO or FAO deal with data quality issues? What kinds of mechanisms do you guys have in place?
No, for that, I'm really not the right person because I'm not working with the data, and I don't want to. No, also it's a big issue, and you would have to ask the people who work with the data. But in terms of data quality and interoperability, I think interoperability, as Medha said, helps in the sense that it helps you validate the data because you reuse the data. On the other hand, if you don't do it well with reusability and you lose provenance, if you don't do provenance well, then after 2 or 3 or 4 stages of the data, the reuse of the data, you've lost completely the provenance. And even if you want to trace back where the quality problem happened, it becomes difficult. So it's one of the additional complexities of interoperability and reusability of data, that in the stages that it gets reused, you can lose all the provenance, and then you're not able to go back and trace. That's the other thing. But yeah, I agree with Medha.
But Medha, you wanted to add something here.
Yes, I did. I did mention, and I think Rob got to it a little bit too, but I did mention when I ended my presentation of the so what. And so I think it's pretty critical also to have those pipelines on the research end as well, to be able to easily use the data that you're making findable and accessible, because only through pushing it through those pipelines, and in our world, in terms of interacting, giving back to farmers and our broader stakeholders through dashboards and decision support tools, that's where you start to figure out, okay, well, this data looks really odd. When I start mapping it, I see points that end up in the ocean, or, I see values, these few values just don't make sense. I mean, that's where, when you start putting the data into models, when you start mapping, when you start doing stuff with the data, is when you start seeing what might have escaped in some way, the publication aspect.
So,
Can I jump on that point, Matt?
Yeah, go.
Okay. We just did a report with U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action, the Croatan Institute, and World Business Council for Sustainable Development, looking at how we can use technology and investment to transform U.S. agriculture toward climate-smart, soil-centric practices. And one of the things that we talked about is the need for farmers and ranchers to use FMS and MRV platforms. FMS is farm management systems or ranch management systems, which can take that data from the field and then connect that with the large data sets, many of that we're talking about here. And that's how we can we can help clear out some of that garbage. And then the MRV is management estimation, reporting, and verification platforms. But even in the United States, I think the number is 60% of farmers aren't using digital tools. So we've got to increase the amount of farmers using these platforms so we can connect those large data sets with the data from the farm.
Right. Not just data sets, but data models, right? I mean, those management systems already have essentially data schema that we can leverage.
And train models, yes.
Right.
Yeah, there's a related audience question here. It's kind of this whole usability theme, which I think we can riff on for quite a while. So let's look at the question from Robert, which is, oops, we both clicked it. So Robert's talking about kind of the competing ontology structures and how difficult it is for practitioners to use them. So thinking of the usability of ontologies, let's talk about that, and then maybe just usability of some of the other systems as well. So Valeria, do you have any thoughts on Robert Warren's question here?
Well, the first thought for me is not that it's just ontologies. It's that models. I mean, even with models, it's the same thing. You can have 4 different ways to do the same thing. It's just that if people don't agree on the way of doing things, they will never agree on an ontology. So it's not a problem of the mechanics of how you build an ontology. It's part of the differences that you have of seeing the world and building the models. I'm not sure if this can be overcome with standards and interoperability. I think it can only be overcome by the scientists and the researchers agreeing on the model, and then the ontology aspect comes later.
I'm going to jump in here. Listeners may not realize, but the word ontology actually comes from philosophy, and in fact, the branch of computer science comes out of philosophy, which is essentially about a worldview, a person's worldview, and so it, in some ways, as computer scientists latched onto this term and said we can combine essentially symbolic logic together with this idea of a person's worldview, and link those to the words that people use to describe their worldview, and therefore we can compute over essentially the words and their relationships to each other. So I think that just the roots of where ontology comes from, it makes it inherently difficult, because these ontologies come from very different perspectives often, not just the top-down and bottom-up approaches that Rob and I were talking about earlier, but the fact that a farmer sees things differently than a consumer sees things differently. Different kinds of farmers will see things differently, and from a person who's selling adjuvants for crops.
Matt, can I tell a very quick story here on this?
Please.
Story? I was talking to a Mississippi farmer who was using a farm management tool from Australia, and she had just recently harrowed her field. So she wanted to show that she had done that practice and log that into this farm management tool, and she couldn't find harrowing as a practice. This is because the Australians refer to harrowing as a light tickle. And how Mississippi farmers supposed to know that the Australians call harrowing a light tickle? And it's exactly to your point, which is I would have considered a light tickle something else, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you for your definition of a light tickle. I think that's outside the scope of this show.
But I just want to jump in and say that I think Robert here is absolutely right, and this leads to all kinds of problems. I mean, I just about 10 days ago, I was part of a webinar series where a startup was talking about their efforts to manage particularly agronomic data focused on fertilizer use and precision fertilizer use. And they were talking about the development of an ontology. But then when you started looking at what they were developing, it's probably not an ontology. It is of value to them, for sure. And it is probably potentially a value to the wider world in terms of, representing a very, very large, potentially data dictionary, a vocabulary in its own right. But what happens is that people lose patience waiting for the ontology, the standard, to be developed and to be usable. And I'm on this side too now. I'm increasingly getting frustrated myself, because as a researcher, I completely sympathize with that. You cannot wait for, 10 years for something to be stable. And it's a real problem. So I don't have the answer other than to say that until one of the major answers, I guess I do have an answer, is to actually get the buy-in and the support, both in terms of adoption, the recognition of the value of a standard that cuts across, just my standard or your standard, and the willingness to put some funds behind it, to build it faster and to build it with more, more agreement and more buy-in, and to sustain it. If we're able to get to that point, I think we can go much farther, much quicker.
Right. We are at the top of the hour, and some people have dedicated only 1 hour to this, but I want to get one more question from Chris Baker. Good to see you, Chris. I'm glad you're out here. He's written a lot in the comments, but and then he followed it up with a specific question, which is really right on the heels of what you were just saying, Medha. So the question is, It's great. That what you said sounds great, but how do we actually talk to stakeholders about these issues? Because they are so confusing, they are so nuanced. So what what do you do? I'm going to pose this to each one of you, and we can close out with this. I think how do each one of you do this and have these conversations with your particular stakeholders without confusing them even more? Medha, why don't you start off, since you were just talking about that?
Sure. I think there are different ways of doing this, but for us, I think one of the key ways is to show the value. What is it that we can give you as a funder in terms of return on your investment? What can we give you as a researcher if you would put in the time and the effort to make your what does it give back? What's the value of this? And so I think being able to address that through high value products, data products that are of wider use to others, aggregation, aggregated data sets, large aggregated data sets, data pools that people, more people can operate on, and that machines can leverage. All of that is of value, and we need to be able to communicate that to our stakeholders, and target the message to the different stakeholder effectively. I don't know if that's too general, but I think Chris and I could probably get into a separate conversation about all of this and talk for another hour.
Right. How about you, Rob?
I actually totally agree with Medha that I think you have to show the value, but Chris puts it really well when he says stakeholders, because when I look at this, it's ultimately how can we solve the problems for producers, for food supply chain, for food companies, for consumers. Those are the stakeholders. And so ultimately, how can we show those people that are developing solutions the benefits of having a connected solution versus a disconnected solution, a smart solution versus a dumb solution? We just invested in a company called Afresh that is using AI for grocers to decrease food waste. As an example, the average grocer buys 106 bananas for every 100 bananas they sell, because they never want to run out of bananas. How can we actually forecast demand and supply better to optimize that performance and show the A/B test that the folks that are using an intelligent connected solution are seeing the benefit from having connected data? I'd also really encourage folks to look at Alibaba's HEMA or Hippo, which is Alibaba has connected a supply chain. And so as an example, by working with Fonterra, their milk producer, the average life of milk on the shelf went from something like 5 to 7 days to 1 day. So they're seeing real-time fresher milk. They also have the ability to provide Chinese consumers with the information related to most of the products in the store, all the way back to the farm. What temperature was that product transported at? The business license of the people that have touched that product. That's the benefit of having a connected solution with interoperability.
I agree. I just didn't realize that Chinese consumers were drinking Hippo milk.
It's not Hippo. It's Hippo Fresh is the name. That's it.
How about you, Valeria? How I realize you're working on these classification systems now for the FAO. And do you see yourself moving into ontology sometime soon? And how do you convince your stakeholders in the FAO that these are worthwhile pursuits?
I noticed that it's a totally different thing if you're thinking about ontology and speaking to stakeholders about complex things like ontology, or if you're speaking about just interoperability. Interoperability is not a difficult thing to sell. Ontologies are, and you also have to justify why you need them. And for instance, what happened in FAO was that the group where I'm in now, they were working on statistical classifications. So they were already working with standards. They were familiar with a lot of concepts, and it was mostly a matter of translating the terminology that you were using for ontologies and for semantic web into the terminology that they use for statistical classifications, and the concepts are not so different. But the way you communicate is completely different depending on the stakeholders. Of course, you cannot communicate in the same way. Researchers understand ontologies, I see, very easily. It's in terms of models, they work on models, so for them, ontologies are not so difficult to understand. A statistician would understand classifications, but you can easily translate into these two. But if you talk to other stakeholders, like farmers, of course, I think it should be completely transparent to them. They shouldn't care at all what ontologies are, and they should just get to the problem and understand how the problem can be solved. And you can only speak in terms of interoperability. I think that's the key word that you that sells things, interoperability. And in the value chain, if you talk to farmers about how the value chain works better with interoperability, that's already a selling point. Ontologies are very, very, very difficult. Yeah.
Thanks, Valeria. And
a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and what a great conversation. I think we could probably keep going on the rest of the day and not run out of interesting things to talk about. But we're past time. So on behalf of myself and Matthew and all of our virtual audience, thank you, Rob, Valeria, Medha, for joining us today. What a great conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Before we sign off, I just want to remind folks that our No Food episodes are the third Thursday of every month. And the next third Thursday is April 15th. That show will be No Food Composition. Better food composition data means better diets and better health. We'll dig into efforts focused on alignment and interoperability of data around food, nutrition, and health. So if you like what you're seeing here, by all means, hit the subscribe button down below and stay in the know. And thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.